The bailiff's voice filled the courtroom before I even reached my chair. All rise for the Honorable Judge Elena Mercer. I walked through the side door, adjusted my robe, and took my seat behind the bench. The room settled. I looked out at the gallery, at the attorneys arranging their papers, at the court reporter positioning her fingers, and then my eyes landed on the plaintiff's table. My mother was wearing a blue blazer I didn't recognize. My father had gained weight. They were both staring at the defendant's table, completely relaxed, almost bored. They had no idea. I set down my pen. I took one breath. And then I called the case. But let me take you back to where this story actually begins. Because nothing about that morning in the courtroom made sense without the Tuesday afternoon 30 years earlier, when my parents told me to sit on a bench outside the hospital entrance and wait. I was 7 years old. My father crouched down in front of me and held both my hands the way he did when he was about to explain something important. He smelled like the coffee he always drank from a blue thermos. He said my mother needed to go inside and handle some paperwork, and that it would take a little while, and that I needed to stay right here on this bench, and not move and not talk to anyone and count the cars in the parking lot until they got back. Start counting, he said. Don't stop until we come out. I started counting. I got to 63 before I understood they weren't coming back. A hospital security guard named Roy noticed me sitting there as the afternoon shifted into evening. He brought me a juice box from the vending machine inside and sat with me on the bench without saying anything for a while. Then he asked if I knew my parents' phone number. I recited it perfectly. He called it from his cell phone and let me listen to it ring. No answer. He tried 3 more times over the next hour. Nothing. Roy stayed with me until a social worker arrived. Her name was Patricia, and she had a kind face and a yellow cardigan, and she wrote everything I told her down in a small notebook while I sat on a plastic chair inside the hospital lobby. My name, my address, my parents' names, my birthday. She wrote it all down and nodded and told me I was very brave. I wasn't brave. I was terrified. I just didn't know how to show it yet. The next 2 years were a rotation of foster placements. Some were fine, some were not. I learned to be quiet and small and useful. I learned how to read a room before I walked fully into it. I learned that the fastest way to make adults uncomfortable was to need something from them, so I stopped needing things. Or at least I stopped showing it. When I was 9, I was placed with a man named Dr. Harold Chen. He was 61 years old, recently retired from 40 years as a pediatric surgeon, and had converted the second bedroom of his house in Portland into what I can only describe as the most complete library I had ever seen in a private home. Floor-to-ceiling shelves, a rolling ladder, 2 leather chairs positioned under a window that faced the backyard garden. The social worker walked me through his front door on a Wednesday morning, and Harold Chen shook my hand like I was an adult. "I've been told you're a reader," he said. "I try to be," I said. "Good," he said. "I have a lot of books." He was not warm the way people in movies are warm. He didn't hug me or make a big speech about how I was safe now, or how things were going to be different. What he did was treat me like a person with a functioning brain from the very first day, which was more than most adults had done. He helped me with my homework every night at the kitchen table, not by doing it for me, but by asking questions until I found the answer myself. He attended every school event I had, even the boring ones. He drove me to the library on Saturday mornings and let me choose whatever I wanted. He never once made me feel like a burden or a charity case or a problem he was managing. When I was 11, he sat me down and asked if I would like him to formally adopt me. I said yes before he finished the sentence. He laughed. It was the first time I heard him really laugh. He said, "Well, that was easy. I took his name. I became Elena Chen. We had 17 years together before he got sick. He was diagnosed with a progressive neurological condition when I was in my 2nd year of law school. I came home as often as I could. I called every night. In the summers between semesters, I lived at home and handled his appointments and made sure his medications were organized and sat with him in the library, reading in the 2 leather chairs the way we had since I was 9 years old. He never once complained. That was his way. He passed away on a Thursday morning in November, 2 months after I passed the bar exam. I held his hand. I told him what he had given me. I don't think I will ever adequately describe what it felt like to lose him, so I won't try. What I will say is that every decision I made after that, every case I studied, every argument I built, every year I climbed, I built on the foundation he laid when he shook my hand like an adult and showed me his library. 6 months after his passing, I sat in an attorney's office and learned the contents of his will. Harold had lived simply. His house was paid off. His retirement was well managed. He had spent 40 years as a surgeon and 50 years being careful with money, and he had more than I ever would have imagined. The total estate came to $4.3 million. He left it to me. All of it. I cried in the attorney's office in a way I hadn't let myself cry at the funeral. The attorney, a practical man named David, handed me a box of tissues and gave me time. I was 32 years old. I had just been appointed to the county circuit court. I had a house I was still paying off, and a life I had built from nothing, and a father who had believed in me so completely that he had trusted me with everything he had. I didn't touch the inheritance for months. It didn't feel real. It felt like it belonged to him still. Then, 8 months after the will was settled, I received a certified letter. My biological parents were suing me for the inheritance. I read the letter twice. Then I set it down on my kitchen counter and stood very still for a long moment. They were claiming emotional damages, loss of parental relationship. They had obtained a copy of the adoption records and the probate filing, public record, both of them, and they had found an attorney willing to argue that because Harold had no biological children, and I was not his natural heir, the estate should revert to my family of origin, as I had been a minor when the adoption was processed under what they were calling circumstances that precluded parental consent. They were arguing, 25 years later, that the abandonment had never been intentional, that there had been a misunderstanding, that they had come back to the hospital and I was already gone. I set the letter down and I thought about a 7-year-old girl counting cars in a parking lot while the sun went down. I called David. He read the filing and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Elena, this case has essentially no legal merit. Your adoption was finalized when you were 9. The statute of limitations on any parental rights claim has long since passed. Their claim on Harold's estate is based on a legal theory that courts have consistently rejected." "I know," I said. "So you understand this is likely going nowhere?" "I know," I said again. He paused. "You also know that as a sitting judge, they'll need to recuse yourself from anything related to this." "I know that too. So what do you want to do?" I thought about it for a moment. "I want to let it go to court," I said. David was quiet for a beat. "Any particular reason?" "I want them to have to show up," I said. "I want them to have to sit in a courtroom and say out loud what they're claiming, in front of a judge, on the record." He thought about that. Then he said, "Okay, I'll prepare a response." What neither of us knew at that point. What was a coincidence so precise it still makes me shake my head when I think about it, was that the case would be assigned by random rotation to the county circuit court. My court. My clerk flagged it the moment it came across the docket. She came into my office, closed the door, and set the file on my desk without saying anything. I looked at the case number. I looked at the names of the plaintiffs. I said, "I'll need to recuse." She nodded. "Of course." She started to pick up the file. I put my hand on it for a moment. Just one moment. Then I let her take it. The case was reassigned to Judge Patricia Harmon, a colleague of mine who had been on the bench for 22 years and had seen everything. I did not tell her anything about my personal connection. I did not need to. The details were all in the filing. What I did not know, what I could not have known, was that Judge Harmon would recuse herself 2 weeks before the hearing date due to a family medical situation, and that the case would be reassigned a second time. To me. I found out on a Monday morning when my clerk put the file on my desk again. "Second reassignment?" she said quietly. I looked at it. "Has counsel for both parties been notified of the judge assignment?" "Not yet. Notification goes out this afternoon." I sat with it for a moment. Ethically, I knew what I was supposed to do. I was supposed to recuse immediately, file the paperwork, send it back for a third assignment. I was a named defendant in a civil matter. There was no interpretation of judicial ethics that allowed me to preside over my own case. But there was also no rule that said the notification had to go out before I made a decision. I called David. "Tell me exactly how you'd like to proceed," he said. "I want to hear their argument," I said. "One time in person, from the bench." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Elena, I know. You can't do this, I know. So what are you actually asking me?" I thought about it. "I want to know if you think 5 minutes is enough time." He understood me. He had known me for 9 years by then. He said, "For what you want them to feel when they walk in and see you sitting up there?" "Yes." A very long pause. "Probably," he said. "Yes." The morning of the hearing, I arrived early. I reviewed the file one more time, though I knew it completely by then. I knew every paragraph of their complaint. I knew every exhibit David had prepared for the defense. I knew what they were claiming, and I knew why it would fail, and I knew exactly what it had cost. A 7-year-old girl to be left on a bench outside a hospital while her parents walked away. My clerk came in at 8:45 and said, "Both parties are present in the gallery." I nodded. "Judge, are you sure about this?" I looked at her. She had been with me for 4 years. She was careful and precise, and she cared about doing things right, which was why I trusted her. "No," I said honestly, "but I'm going to do it anyway." She nodded once. Then she went to her position outside the courtroom door. I heard her voice through the door. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Elena Chen Mercer." I walked through the side door and up to the bench, and I sat down. I arranged my papers. I looked out at the courtroom. My mother saw me first. I watched it move across her face. Confusion, then recognition. Then something that wasn't quite fear, but was adjacent to it. She leaned toward my father and said something. He looked up. His face went completely still. I let them look at me for a moment. I did not smile. I did not signal anything. I was a judge in a courtroom, and I had a job to do, and I was going to do it the way Harold Chen had taught me to do every job, thoroughly, precisely, and without flinching. I said, "This is civil case number 24, CV 20-38031. Plaintiff's counsel, please state your appearance for the record." Their attorney, a man I didn't recognize, young, probably hadn't fully read the case before accepting it, stood up and stated his name. His voice was steady, but I watched him glance between me and his clients with an expression I recognized. He was doing math. Something wasn't adding up for him. "Defense counsel," I said. David stood. David Huang, appearing on behalf of the defendant, Elena Chen Mercer. My mother made a sound. Not loud, just a small sound. Her attorney turned toward her and she shook her head tightly. "Plaintiff's counsel," I said. "You may present your opening statement." He stood and gathered himself and delivered a clean enough opening, considering the material he was working with. He argued that my parents had not willingly abandoned me, that there had been a family crisis that day 25 years ago, that they had attempted to locate me afterward and been unable to navigate the foster care system, and that the inheritance I had received was, in their view, the direct result of a life trajectory that had begun in their home, and that they deserved recognition of that contribution. I listened to every word. David stood and delivered a 7-minute opening statement. He was calm and precise and devastating. He cited the adoption statutes. He cited the timeline. He cited the police report from the evening I was found, the one my parents had never filed, the one Roy, the security guard, had filed on my behalf. He mentioned, quietly, that my biological parents had collected a $9,000 life insurance payout 2 years after my abandonment by reporting me as a dependent who had died in a car accident. A car accident that had never happened. A death that had never happened. A death that had never occurred. The courtroom was very quiet by the time he sat down. My mother was looking at the table in front of her. I said, "Plaintiff's counsel, call your first witness." He called my mother to the stand. She walked up and was sworn in and sat down, and for the first time in 25 years, I was looking directly at her face from less than 30 feet away. She was 63 years old. She looked tired. She looked like someone who had made a lot of decisions they were trying not to think about. Her attorney asked her to describe the events of the day I was left outside the hospital. She said it had been a medical emergency. She said my father had suffered a sudden health episode and that she had been overwhelmed and frightened and had left me outside, intending to come back within minutes. She said when she came out, I was gone. She said she had looked for me. She said she had never stopped thinking about me. Her attorney sat down. David stood up. He asked her gently about the insurance claim. He asked her when she had filed it. He asked her what documentation she had submitted. He asked her whether she had filed a missing child report. She had not. He asked whether she had contacted the hospital to ask whether I had been found. She had not. He asked whether, in the 25 years between that afternoon and the filing of this lawsuit, she had made any attempt through any channel to locate me. A long pause. She said she hadn't known where to start. David nodded slowly. He said, "And when did you become aware of your daughter's identity and current occupation?" Another pause. She said, "About 3 months ago." "And how did you become aware of it?" She glanced at her attorney. He gave her a small nod. "Through a probate search," she said. "We were looking at the inheritance filing. The name was listed publicly. We recognized it." David said, "So it was the inheritance that prompted you to make contact after 25 years. She said, "We wanted to reconnect with our daughter." He said, "Through a lawsuit." Her attorney objected. I sustained it. But the question was already in the room. David sat down. I called a 10-minute recess. In my chambers, I stood at the window for a moment. My clerk brought me water. I drank it and set the glass down and looked at the framed photo I keep on my desk. Harold and me at my law school graduation, both of us squinting into the sun. Him in a blazer he'd pressed himself. Me in a gown that was slightly too big. Both of us grinning in that particular way of people who've been through something hard together and come out the other side of it. I picked up the file. I went back to the bench. I said, "Before we continue, I need to address something for the record." Both attorneys looked up. I said, "I am the defendant in this case, Elena Chen Mercer, named in the complaint. I became aware of this case when it was assigned to my court, and I should have recused immediately. That is the correct procedure, and I failed to follow it. I watched the plaintiff's attorney's face process this. I said, I am recusing myself now. This case will be reassigned. The record will reflect that no substantive rulings were made under my presiding." I set down my pen. I looked at my parents. My mother was looking at me directly for the first time since I had walked in. My father still had that stillness in his face, that frozen quality. I said, "Not as a judge, just as a person, just as myself. I want you to understand something. Not for the case. The case is over as far as I'm concerned. David is going to handle it, and you are going to lose, and you already know that." Their attorney started to stand. I held up one hand. He sat back down. "I want you to understand," I said, "that I am not angry. I spent a long time being angry, and I made a decision at some point to put that down, because it was heavy and it wasn't helping me build anything. I built something anyway. Harold Chen showed me how. I gathered my papers. What I do want you to understand is that there is a 7-year-old girl who sat outside a hospital counting cars until it got dark. She didn't know what she had done wrong. She spent years trying to figure it out. She spent years being small and quiet and careful so that no one would need to send her away again." I paused. "She turned out fine, actually. She turned out better than fine. But that's not because of anything you did. That's in spite of it." I stood. "This court is in recess." I walked back through the side door. My clerk was waiting in the hallway. She didn't say anything. She just handed me a cup of coffee and walked with me back to my chambers. The case was reassigned to Judge Thomas Webb, who had it for 6 weeks before granting summary judgment in my favor. There was no legal basis for my parents' claim. The adoption had been legal. Harold's will had been legal. The insurance fraud from 25 years earlier was referred to the state attorney's office for review. My father received a formal notice of investigation. My mother cooperated and received reduced charges. My father was ultimately fined and given 2 years of supervised probation. It was not the dramatic punishment that part of me had once imagined, but it was real. It was documented. It was on the record. David called me when it was over. He said, "You know, for a judge, you're really bad at following procedure." I said, "I recuse myself." He said, "After 5 minutes of whatever that was." I said, "I needed them to see me." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Did it help?" I thought about it honestly. I thought about my mother's face when I walked through that door. I thought about my father going still. I thought about the way the room had felt. Not triumphant, not satisfying in the way I had maybe expected, but something else. Something quieter, like a door closing. "Yes," I said. "I think it did. I used the first portion of Harold's estate to establish a foundation. I called it the Chen Foundation, because it was his and it should carry his name. The focus is on educational support for children who age out of the foster care system, college applications, test prep, housing assistance during school breaks when the dorms close and there's nowhere to go. In the first year, we served 43 young people. In the second year, 1 in 12. Harold had spent 40 years putting children back together in operating rooms. It seemed right to use what he left me to keep doing that work in a different way. I still have the 2 leather chairs from his library. They're in my home office now, positioned under a window the same way he had them. On Saturday mornings, sometimes I sit in one of them and read, the same way I did from the time I was 9 years old. And sometimes I think about him sitting in the other one, asking questions until I found the answer myself. I think he would have had something precise and unsentimental to say about everything that happened. He would have found the insurance fraud particularly interesting from a legal standpoint. He would have asked me 3 or 4 sharp questions about the ethics of my decision to sit on that bench for those 5 minutes. And then, I think, he would have nodded, and we would have gone back to reading. So let me ask you this. My parents walked into that courtroom expecting a stranger in a robe. They got me instead. If you had been sitting in my chair, if the people who had left you behind showed up 30 years later with their hands out, what would you have done? Would you have recused immediately? Would you have let the system handle it without looking them in the eye? Or would you have needed them to see you, just once, as the person you became without them? Tell me in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. I'll be reading every single response.